Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the podium Mr. Dabbiere.
Thank you. I think somebody printed my wiki page, my LinkedIn profile, my Twitter account, I don't know where all that came from. I didn't know I had that much written about me. Who here has ever heard of Manhattan Associates? I'm not building these like world-beating known companies. Who here's heard of at least AirWatch? All right, well, that's a little bit better. At least I'm on the right track. Next one will be a Twitter or something. Who here wants to start their own company? Who wants to be an entrepreneur and really start something yourself? Who really wants to be an intrapreneur and do something great inside another company? That's good. That's good. What I want to do, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey that was first with a company, Manhattan Associates, then with AirWatch, and the two have some related aspects. And then I'm going to go through a series of what I consider the lessons that I learned in those two processes and building out those two companies. So to start with, these two companies, first of all, Manhattan Associates, a damn boring business, logistics and distribution and supply chain that we managed to make sound sexy so we could recruit students. But they do software for logistics and distribution, but a $2.7 billion market cap today. So they're doing well, about 2,500 employees. And the interesting thing there is I started that company when I was, I think, 29 years old, built it with no outside capital, started it in Manhattan Beach, California, got to 30 employees and thought that that was the wrong place for a software company, moved it to Atlanta, and in 3 years we went from 30 to 800 employees in public. So it took me 5 years to get from a startup to 30 people, and then 3 years, we obviously figured something out. And it really reminds me of the old expression that, you know, the actor, they're an overnight success after 10 years at dinner theater. You know, there is no such thing, or very seldom is there such a thing as an overnight success. And part of what I want to really drive in this presentation to you is that while there may not be often overnight successes, there are lots of ways to be successful. I know people that are wildly great speakers, wildly gregarious, great salespeople, really successful. I know people that are really thoughtful and introverted, and yet they really dig in to an area and wildly successful. I actually know somebody who won the lottery. God bless them. Wildly successful, but I don't want to count on that method between you and me. And the point is that there are lots of ways to be successful. You, fortunately, only need to find one of them, your way. The second company was started a number of years later, and I'll talk about the transition. But AirWatch was started with one of the original employees from my first company, Manhattan Associates, with me. And note that there is a connection there. And what you're going to find is that relationships are one of those big drivers. And that company went from 100, took us, well, my partner started it in 2003, and it floundered a little bit, brought me in 2006. We still sort of floundered a bit until 2010, and then suddenly we found the market that we needed to be in. And well, Manhattan Associates stayed with exactly the same thing. There was no pivot, if you will. What we started with was a pretty straight shot into where we ended up. With AirWatch, we ended up with a couple pivots. We weren't exactly in the right business to begin with, but when we finally found a good business, again, we went from 100 to 2,000 employees in about 3.5 years. Tremendous growth. And so you don't always have to wed yourself to your first idea. And that's going to be a little bit of a theme to this. So let me talk about my first company, Manhattan Associates. There's one last theme that I'm going to really drive home to you, which is, well, I said that there are lots and lots of ways to be successful. I think that there is one characteristic of successful people that is really undeniable, and that is tenacity. And whether it takes you a year or 5 years or 10 years, to find that success, you're going to find that the people that are like that chihuahua on the pant leg that just won't let go of it tend to be the ones that are really, really successful. And you're going to see that as a little bit of a theme through here. So I was a consultant for a small consulting firm, Kurt Salmon Associates. Started working with developers from India back in 1987, a little bit before the whole internet Indian development craze, maybe before a lot of you were born, I hate to think. And started working with these developers from India and in a company, and had the idea that, boy, this is a great thing, had an idea of a company, started the company, and actually my partners came to me about a year into it and said, the company that we started and the economics and the ownership of the company doesn't make sense to us anymore. We want to completely renegotiate our agreement with you. And I did everything I could to talk them out of that. We had a company up and running, we had customers, we had things that were going well. And yet they came to me and said, we are going to completely change the deal that was struck and the way we're building this company. And I could not talk them out of changing that. And I finally got up out of the room and I said, I've got a way. It was all about ownership. And at the time I owned, and I'd funded the company and owned 50% of the company, and they wanted to take me to 20% and spread the rest of the equity evenly. And I tried to talk them out of this. They wouldn't listen, and finally I had to get up out of, and I said, I can give you a way to own 100% of the company. And I got up and I walked out of the room. I found a whole new set of partners, and I completely reconstituted the company. So I had to sort of hit the Alt-Control-Delete button, because once I had hit a point where this was not a group of people that I wanted to go down that journey with, it didn't matter because they were brilliant. But the point was, this was not going to be the right way for me. And it gets back to really setting your compass, setting your moral compass and saying, you know, I can only work with people that I believe in, because you're going to be in battle. What I will tell you is there are lots of people that are great, great partners when times are going really, really well. But you really, really need to be with a group of people that you believe in and trust, and you want to be in a foxhole when things aren't going so well. So we started this company, and I started an office in India in 1991. I woke up on my first day to go out and see this new Indian office that I had started. This is what I saw outside my window when I walked out the door. It was a really humbling experience, and I was pretty young at the time and had not had a lot of experiences in international. And yet, again, I'm going to talk about the perseverance of building this company, living in Manhattan Beach. My first company was actually in Kenosha, Wisconsin, Jockey International. I managed to spend 18 months, including 2 winters. And what I realized is that the people in Wisconsin are truly the strong. God bless them. Anybody who can endure winters on the lake in Wisconsin. Once again, leaving Manhattan Beach to go there and to literally leave my apartment on the beach and spend 18 months there building essentially this company. We started out just doing contract work and custom programming. We had an idea of a product that we wanted to build. I took all of the revenues that we were making on services, doing contract programming, invested it in building a product. And then the fortunate thing happened. I was actually talking to the CIO, who I'd gotten to be very friendly with, and said, I am willing to trade you my programmer's time for some of your computer time. I've built this product, but I don't have a big enough computer to really do proper compilation and testing. Can we make a trade? And he said, well, tell me what product you're building. I explained it to him, and he said, you know, you must have the CEO's office bugged, because he slammed his fist on the desk this morning and said, we need to solve this problem. And they became our first customer. And sometimes life just happens like that. This was actually our first office in Manhattan Beach. I think it might have been a converted old hotel. The best I can say, it was pretty darn humble. But we didn't have any outside capital. Like I said, we built this entire company bootstrapped from the ground up. We owned all of the equity as an employee team when we took it public. And we treated nickels like manhole covers. We got to be that 30 people, and I said, you know what? California is not the right place for this business. We picked up the entire company, every employee moved, and we moved to Atlanta. And it was about doing the right thing for our customers, quite frankly, for our employees. Most of our employees were from upstate New York. We had a great recruiting process. We would take kids from Clarkston University in upstate New York, put them on the beach for 3 days, and let me tell you, we never had an offer rejected. These guys were like, in February, it was like, get me the hell out of the snow, and I'm in. Never even had a salary negotiation. But as we sort of saw that between cost of living and a lot of things that I think every one of our employees was on a red eye every week because most of our business was in the East Coast. It's where the people are, and we needed to be at our customer. We weren't the type of software company where we were a help desk or where we were coding on our own time. We needed to be very engaged and on-site with our customer, and I could just see the travel was wearing everybody down. So we ended up moving the company to Atlanta over the 4th of July weekend. Everybody told me I was crazy, I need consultants, so we literally hired our own trucks. We moved the entire company. We moved every employee and all their worldly possessions in trucks that we just sort of rented. We left on a Sunday. 4th of July was Tuesday. We were back up and running on a Wednesday. I remember somebody telling me about the move that Richardson Vicks was going to do and how you just can't move families like this. You need psychologists and you need people to help with relocation, and you need consultants, and you need all this. And I heard this story that was just bigger than a bread box. I said, well, how did that move go? He goes, oh, well, they got everybody so worked up they canceled it. Sometimes you just got to go do these things. I mean, you can overanalyze and overthink a lot of things. So Manhattan went public, and a lot of good things happened, and we bounced around until they didn't go so well. We actually went into 1999, and the most surprising thing happened in 1999. It was the year before Y2K. And everybody was shocked and surprised, including me. And the shock and surprise was nobody wanted to be installing warehouse systems on the eve of the end of the world. Oracle was doing horribly. PeopleSoft got sold to Oracle, I think, as a result of that whole thing. All the enterprise software companies were having a disaster because, quite frankly, none of us anticipated that in 1998, 1999, one of the things, interestingly, that drove the tech bubble was that every IT shop had to do something with their employees in 98 and 99 because they weren't doing all of the enterprise work. Because if they had fixed Y2K, the last thing they wanted to do was do some big ERP installation or anything that touched their enterprise systems. So they were looking for other projects for their IT department to do, and voila, the .com stuff was all there, e-commerce, websites, all of that. And anybody that hadn't fixed Y2K, guess what their entire IT department was doing? Y2K. But nobody really expected this. So we had a stock price that went from 30 to 3 in 6 months by the middle of 1999. Now, interestingly, by the first quarter of 2000, we were back to 30. What I will tell you was it was a really difficult time. And what you don't really think about is when you're in that position as CEO running a company whose stock price has gone from 30 to 3, number one, you've got a lot of disgruntled employees. Number two, they don't understand it because the world is moving ahead. I mean, it was when all of the .com companies that had never made a profit were selling at 1,000, and you are a company that has been profitable for 10 years, and they can model you. And so it was a very uneven period in the world. And my biggest goal was to keep everybody in the company and to give them the assurances that things were going to get better. Needless to say, within 6 months we had recovered, and by 12 months we were at an all-time high, and realized that we had a company that had an awful lot of equity in our employees. And a lot of that is really what helped us weather that, but mainly it was the reassurance of those individuals that this is not permanent. And my lesson there is that is where you are really tested. That is where you need partners that you can rely on, and that you've got a real rudder in the water, and that you've connected with your employees, because you don't fix those problems when they happen. The fixing of those problems was built through the years and years that we did building those employees, giving them equity, caring about them. And we lost very few people through that process. Alas, I did step up to chairman of the board, decided to take some time off, actually ended up, my daughter was born, lived on a boat for 2 years. I highly recommend it if anybody gets that opportunity. And you know, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I ended up moving to Washington, D.C. And honestly, didn't really think I would necessarily start another company. I kind of had an eye open. I thought that if I stumbled into something, I thought maybe if I become an investor in something. And the funny thing is that life just kind of happens. Life comes at you. And I think the more you look for something to happen, the less it happens. The more you let it kind of find you, the more successful you'll be. So one of my first employees from Manhattan Associates had started a company called Wandering Wi-Fi. If you've ever opened up your laptop at a Panera Bread, they basically run that network. It was Wi-Fi in coffee shops. Now, we didn't have Panera Bread, or he didn't at that time. He was fighting with a partner. Boy, that story sounds familiar. He had a 50-50 partner that was a contract programmer. And his view of life was you work for 3 to 6 months and you make a bunch of money, and then you go on vacation for 3 to 6 months, and you do a cycle of that. Or work is to go out and play. And my partner wanted to build a big business, and he had a very incompatible partner in terms of what their goals were. He literally wanted to go 3 months, take a month off, go 3 months, take a month off. And they had gotten to where there were, you know, a couple hundred coffee shops that they had built some technology. And they had met, this person had left our AirWatch and gone to a venture-backed company called Solaris that didn't do real well. They got bought by GE Information Systems, and then they started this company. So that was their history together. So he came to me and said, Alan, I've got this situation. My partner and I aren't getting along. We want to separate the business. And he was visiting me on the boat, and we were down in Sicily. And against this beautiful backdrop, this guy's life is crumbling because when he put years into this business, and it wasn't going well. So I gave him some advice on how to separate the business. He left the boat. He went back with all this wisdom that I had armed him with, and it went nowhere. So he came back to me and said, I need some more advice. So I gave him some more ideas, and they didn't work. So I gave him a third set of ideas, and they didn't work. And I realized I'm not really good with advice. But what I did say to him is, look, there's 2 of you in this business. It's not that complicated. Get a number from him. Don't tell him I'm involved. I'll buy him out. I'll be a silent partner. You go build the business. I've got a lot of belief in you. And he and I had stayed in touch. And I really thought this was one of these guys that I kiddingly said if he was in the if he had been in the restaurant business, we might be flipping burgers today, because I would have done anything with this guy because he was that good. Well, this was his office. You see any similarities here? Actually, the first time that I parked there, and before I got to the front door, I was addressed by a lovely young lady that wanted to know if I wanted to spend a few minutes with her. That was the kind of neighborhood that was. It's a little rough. But again, he was bootstrapping this company, treating nickels like manhole covers. And he told me the story about when he was at Solaris. And this was part of what I liked about him. And it's not just this story, because don't listen to what people say, but listen to how they act. And he said, you know, I knew Solaris was not going to be successful. They got a $40 million round of funding in the height of the dot-com bubble, and all of the senior leadership was fighting about who got what kind of chair. And that became one of the most important things, was number 1, which chairs do we buy? 2, does everybody in the company get the same chair? Or are we going to have executive chairs, mid-level management chairs, and employee chairs? And he said it truly started to consume the company for a while. And he said, after seeing the practical way Manhattan Associates was built, I just couldn't believe this. And then the 2002 hit, and this thing crashed, and that's when he sort of went off in 2003 and did his own thing. So the other thing that I realized after trying to sell Wi-Fi to coffee shops was that was not a great business. And I said, John, and he said, look, Alan, I never thought this was a great business, but I wanted to get into wireless technology. And sometimes you just need to get started somewhere. Sometimes you just need to get a toe in the water and figure out where you go. So my first pivot on the business with him was to move it over to doing network management for enterprises. And what I found was trying to out Cisco just wasn't a real good business model either. And one of the experiences that I'd had at Manhattan Associates was there was a lot of mobile technology in a warehouse. If you see those sort of ruggedized devices, remember I'm going back to sort of 2006, 2007 now. And I knew these companies, and I said, there's 3 or 4 companies in that mobile, ruggedized device management space. And I know those companies pretty well, and if we can't put them out of business, shame on us. I know them, and that's the kind of market I like to go into. I always say, if you want to make money, you want to go into something like waste management. Get into the stuff that nobody else wants to be in and make it really successful. So we started going into the building product to manage these ruggedized devices. And yet we knew that there was a difference that we had, the fact that we could still see the network, we could see these devices, there were some security issues, and we knew that mobility was really growing. I mean, the iPhone had come out, but it wasn't really a manageable device. We were looking at smartphones. If you remember, it was really just the BlackBerry at that time. And so this gets back to where great companies aren't built in conference rooms. They're built in the real world when you get involved in the business. And I'm a firm believer that every business can pivot a little bit. So all of a sudden, if you remember kind of the history of the smartphone world, and by the way, I'm going to leave quite a bit of time. I hope to leave a good bit of time at the end of this for questions. So I want you to be thinking about what you might want to talk about in this at the end. So we were chugging along in this mobile device management, Windows Mobile, ruggedized, back to, not exactly what I would call the sexiest business in the world. And in the middle of 2010, Apple kind of revolutionized the world. Prior to that, the smartphones had very little management. There was something called OMA-DM, Open Mobile Alliance, where you could put a passcode on a phone. You think about a BlackBerry, it's a pretty simple device. It gave me email, and there was not a lot of configuration to it. As a company, once I decided how complicated I wanted the passcode, pretty much I'd figured out how I wanted it configured, because everything else was pretty much the same for every employee. When Apple came out with the iPhone 4, it was the first time that a smartphone with a browser that was designed to run a lot of applications with this user interface was really built for the business. Prior to 2010, the only way I could really use an iPhone at work was I had to buy a third-party piece of software that I put my email on, because the Apple email was generally not considered secure enough. And secondly, they didn't really build the infrastructure to have personal email and corporate email side by side. And the big revolution that Apple put onto iPhone 4 was a full set of security, a full set of being able to separate the phone between business and personal, and use that same phone in both applications. And this is when our business just absolutely exploded. So from 2011, we went into 2011 with really almost no customers and 100 employees. And this is where today we've got almost 15,000 customers and 2,000 employees. And it was really explosive at that point. So today, this is, within about a year, I think we had moved into this office that we're in today. So we went from the Roxy to something in between, but to this. And it gets back to that, knowing where that inflection point really hits. So this is the screen that we show when we get started. 14,000 customers, 2,000 employees, et cetera. My lesson to this screen, though, is not, I would never get into a sales presentation and read that. One of the things I teach all of our people that are developing businesses, every company has to have a bit of a shtick. One thing I'm going to say is, as you start to think about your business, think about how you're going to position it, because I'm going to argue every software company is a fashion product. I'm going to get more into this in a little bit. But we would sit down at this slide and say, you know what? One thing that we realized, first of all, I started, and I'm not going to say that the relationship between Manhattan Associates and AirWatch was very strong, But if you read, for example, in Silicon Valley, they talk about the founder story and how important that is. There's a little bit of poetic justice to some of those stories. And so we would say, look, my background, Manhattan Associates, used all of those ruggedized devices, 25 years of recognizing that mobile is death by 1,000 cuts. Every device needs to be secured and configured and supported. God bless, I'm the IT manager of my own house, and I will tell you, when my wife doesn't get email, I have a really crappy night at home. And the point of that is it made it a little bit funny. And we had some of the greatest personal stories about problems with mobile. I was in Italy with my wife, and God bless, but she took my AT&T card and stuck it in her computer and downloaded one song from iTunes. 5,462 euros later, we had one song because iTunes upgraded before it gave us the song. These are the kinds of things that people could really relate to. When we talked about our company and our size, we would say 2,000 employees, and so many people describe their companies, and so much of the way they describe their company is they describe the space they're in. It's very me too. I'm going to argue if you ever start a company, if you're ever in a company, helping them define who they are and what they do, think about the way you're different, not about the way you're the same. Think about how what you say is going to be interpreted. Because if it sounds like my dad can beat up your dad on the playground, it's not a really compelling statement. We're the biggest, we're the best, we're the strongest, we're the fastest. We would open up with this screen and we would say, no. Number one, 25 years of mobile, we know this better than anybody else. Secondly, 14,000 global customers. We're more than 2 times the customer base larger than our nearest competitor. And at 2,000 employees, our nearest competitor is about 600. We're 3 times the R&D staff. And the fact that there's a new mobile operating system every 15 days, it takes a lot of R&D to keep up with that technology change. And secondly, with that type of commanding lead in market share, we can amortize our costs over the largest number of customers and customers so that we can give you the lowest price. And finally is that mobile is death by 1,000 cuts. Every device needs to be secured and supported. So our real job isn't about all that technology, it's about the bottom line. We simplify the process. And one of our customers is Walmart. And they actually worked with us to engineer every minute per device per year out of the process because they've got 1 million employees. And for every minute they save 2 million man minutes. One from the employee and one of the help desk person helping that employee. And Mark Twain had a great expression where he said, if I'd had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. That is what our R&D team brings to you. Now, if you notice in the way we sort of set up our company, it wasn't about we're bigger, we're better, we're faster, the technology. Off of these experiences that we had had and personal stories, we built a great way to convey the message. And clearly, we started this way before we were 14,000 employees. Or customers, rather. But the point was the way we positioned it. Because we were way behind somebody else who was in this market before we were. They were in Silicon Valley. They were venture-backed. And we had to be different. We had to have a better story. Again, realize I'm telling you this because I'm going to get to a lot of this later in this presentation. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about AirWatch now, and then tell you, again, start to set up the lessons. We would go into something like this, customer statistics. Again, you can't, my dad can beat up your dad, this one. We would rattle off every company name. Just what we do real quickly. So we manage these phones. I mean, you think about your phone and you think, why would I want to manage it? Well, the interesting thing is any of you who pull out your phone right now, if you use an iPhone or a Google phone for that matter, if you're a company, you do not want your important data getting out. You do not want, if you are a CFO, you do not want voicemail getting out. And yet, the way a phone is delivered from the factory, or if you don't use something like our product, if I hit this button and say, connection. Great, my phone just locked up. Play voicemail.
Here's your voicemail message from Amar.
Bottom line is, using Siri and voice commands, it will play your voicemail. It will show your contacts. It will show your calendar events. It will read your text to you. And if you're a public company and you've got the CFO and the CEO talking to each other, they probably don't want that information exposed. Secondly, if you just think about the employee process of getting all that configuration right, and this is where we say it's death by 1,000 cuts. Every employee needs to set up their own email, calendar, contacts, Wi-Fi, VPN, applications, content. So we do that management. Like any good company, we built the best product in the world of doing that, and we expanded. And today we do things like application wrapping. So we secure the applications that you put on these devices. We do things like geofencing, time fencing, data loss prevention, cut and paste restrictions, encryption of the data. We have something like Box or Dropbox that you guys all know very well. But we do this for enterprises, and our customers range from, we have the Senate, the House of Representatives, the White House, and the Supreme Court. Those are all customers of AirWatch. We have the government pretty well lined up. So we literally do everybody from Walmart to the Supreme Court, 9 of the top 10 retailers. And again, these are people that want their content distributed and secured. We do our own email. I talked about the fact that when at first you bought these devices, you could not use the native email very securely. Well, there's still companies that don't feel that that email can either be used securely or they cannot manage the phone, and therefore they need to manage the data in the email. So we've built our own email capability, our own browsers. And then finally, we built into something called Workspace, which is we can actually take components of this phone. And this was just the evolution over the last 3 years of building out this full suite of technology. And it's all done in this framework of being able to handle it in large companies, because I mentioned in the old BlackBerry day, you think about, I configure a BlackBerry and the CEO's got pretty much the same configuration for email as my CFO, as my VP of sales, and all my salespeople. Well, you think in today's world, my CFO has very different applications than my salespeople and very different than my R&D people. So the complexity of setting this up is very different. And secondly, I may want to configure it very differently across every region of the world. We talk about, and the way we present our company, we present it with a lot of customer examples. So I'll say, God bless Coca-Cola. But if they go in front of the German Work Council and somebody says, where did you set up your privacy rules? If they say it was done by Bubba in Atlanta, they get roasted. But if they say it was done by Hans in Frankfurt, they're going to get a pretty good outcome. So all of our customers really, rather than just saying multi-tenancy, it's not what we say, it's how we say it. And finally, what we learned is that the more you lock employees down, the more they are going to go around all your security. God bless the investment banker who's got his iPhone in his left pocket, his BlackBerry in his right pocket, pulls out his BlackBerry, emails the email with the address to his iPhone so he can click on it and get where he wants to go, except the bottom half of that email had all of that information about the deal transaction. So what we have found is that you cannot compromise in usability and security because consumers have spoken. They are going to bring the technology into work that they want. And so we truly believe you can't even separate this concept of enterprise mobility and consumer mobility. When you realize that you're now using your phone to open up it's becoming your house key and your car key and your wallet and your credit card and your driver's license. It's where you get your boarding pass. It's where you get all your work information. The point is you can't separate these. And that is, again, part of that message that we give to the enterprise. And finally, the Uberification of our lives. We are all giving away a lot more personal information because of convenience. If I asked somebody to give me their credit card number and let me track them on their GPS tell me all about themselves, nobody would give me that information. But if I say, I will pick you up with a car by clicking one button and drop you off somewhere, and you will never even have to pull out a credit card, I'll tell you where my kids go to school, I'll give you their thumbprints. I'll do anything. Just get me where I want to go. And this is a very scary world we live in right now because at all ages we are trading in all this information. So we build this company. We get it up to where we ultimately get a first round of funding. And if somebody is going to offer you $200 million for 10% of your company, take it. I won't have to explain why I accepted that money. But what it did, we really didn't need the cash. We were doing fantastic, but it set a bar for the valuation of the company that ultimately led to the company being purchased by VMware about 9 months ago for $1.5 billion. And so we had very little outside capital, and I will say, as this philosophy of building very much internally, employees did very, very well. But what we saw on the horizon was the need to continue to expand and expand globally very quickly. God bless VMware. They were bought by EMC 10 years ago for $600 million. Today, they're a $40 billion market valuation company, the fastest growing software company to $5 billion in revenue ever. So they did so much in desktop, in terms of desktop management, and we see this real merger between what's going on in the desktop and mobile, and we saw this as a perfect marriage between the two companies. So this is going to take me to kind of my lessons learned over these two companies, and the first is that 90% of life is just showing up. I talked about when I started Manhattan Associates, I basically was very frustrated with a consulting job at a consulting firm that I was on the road 5 days a week, but just didn't see a career path at. And honestly, when you are a consultant and you quit your job, you are pretty much unemployed. And I would say more than the opportunity of starting something new, it was the getting out of something that I was in, because I didn't even know what company or product or what our company was really going to look like. It started out doing just this contract programming. And we sort of, once we figured out what we were going to do, it became a pretty straight shot. But it wasn't really well defined when we started. And I'm a firm believer that the best way to start a company is to start a company, because you can figure it out. I have never been a big believer in all these business plans, because to start up a company and to figure out what you're going to do a year and 2 years and 3 years out, I don't want to say it's wasted motion. But it's probably more for raising money than it is to really think about what your company is going to do. I think getting a customer, going to trade shows, listening to what people want is the real way to get started. I used to wrestle in high school. I went undefeated my senior year. And you know what? I only knew 2 moves. And I'll tell you, by the end of the season, everybody knew they were coming. But they couldn't stop me. I actually wrestled in college, too. But only for 1 year, because by then they figured it out. Jim Collins had a great expression in his book, and I highly recommend if there's any books you read, Jim Collins, Built to Last and Good to Great. But he says there's 2 kinds of people in this world. There's foxes. Foxes are good at a lot of things. And there's hedgehogs. And 9 times out of 10, hedgehogs, people who kind of dig into one thing, end up being wildly more successful. And during the periods that I was really scaling and building these companies, I ended up with sort of blinders on. And I was blessed the first time. I didn't have a wife, didn't have children, and it was literally 10 years of scaling that company. And I didn't read the newspaper a lot. I didn't watch the news a lot. I didn't see a lot of TV. I wasn't real friendly. And I can tell you that John Marshall, my partner in this business, had a 10-year period very similar to that. And it gets back to that tenacity, that competitiveness, that you're just not going to give up. But it's that willingness to be bold. You know, of anything that I appreciate about Steve Jobs, and look, you know, we all like different things about him, but number one, here's a guy who took his idea from 1983, I think, with the Newton. And you know what? The ecosystem wasn't ready for the Newton. Touch screens didn't exist, the bandwidth didn't exist, the battery life didn't exist. And literally, they put so much into it that they had to abort the whole program. And by 1997, 15 years later, he was able to pull out pretty much the same idea into a new ecosystem and make it wildly successful. Not many people get 2 cracks at the same idea 15 years later. But more importantly, if he had come back into Apple and said, you know what? We're really losing to Microsoft. And if you remember, around that time, Microsoft invested in Apple to keep them alive. That's how much they were on life support. And if he had said, you know what, we're going to double down and we're going to improve that operating system and we're going to be a better, second best PC operating system in the world, you know, trying to out Microsoft, it was even crazier than me trying to out Cisco. And instead he took a step back and said, we got 1,000 products that are failing us. We need to take this company and figure out what our strengths are and do something new. And by building into a simple product that could deliver music, and then leveraging that into the phone and into, actually those products revived the PC business in a certain way. And I compare that to, let's say, BlackBerry. And BlackBerry went out and said, we were the #1 phone system in the world. And yet BlackBerry has tremendous assets in QNX and the Internet of Things. But instead of taking the step back and saying, we need to be revolutionary here, they are trying to be evolutionary and improve what they have. And I've got a ton of respect for the fact that he took a step back, could have cared less about the stock price, and repositioned the whole company. And when you're in that position, you have to do that. I mentioned the philosophy where I think every business can be a great business. I think it's like poker. Every hand's a winner and every hand's a loser. After I had left my first company, Manhattan Associates, their stock and the company kind of languished for a while. It was doing really pretty much the same thing. And the way I heard it described several times was, gosh, we're the prettiest house in a really ugly neighborhood. This whole supply chain, warehouse stuff, it's just, there's so many better places to be. And I'm like, guys, when you live in a neighborhood and it turns into a really crappy neighborhood, what do? You move your family. That's your job. As a CEO, your job is to find better neighborhoods for your company. This idea of blaming the fact that you're the best house in a lousy neighborhood to describe why your share price isn't going up isn't a great excuse. It is your job to find new opportunities. And by the way, that company today is doing fantastic. But they finally got off and found some new things and some more innovative things to do. And my point is that it's not the company that you're in. It's not the market that you're in. I'm going to argue that in every market in the world, there are new and innovative ideas. You think of retail. For God's sakes, it's the oldest business in the world, maybe second oldest. But the bottom line is that every year there are new and innovative retail ideas that come out. Every business has got little elements to it that you can make unique and different and attractive and interesting. Has anybody here ever played Risk? The way you win Risk is you win Australia. It's small, it's defendable, and you get 2 extra armies every turn. It's the same way in life. Every business has got to start out by being a monopoly. I don't care if you are making sandwiches, but if you have the best sandwich shop within a 3-block area that people are willing to walk, you become a monopoly of sandwiches in your geographic area. And the great thing about a monopoly is you get to define the rules of the monopoly. There's an old joke, and by hearing the name in it, you'll know how old it is, but it said, if you don't want to lose, don't play tennis against Andre Agassi. It didn't say if you don't want to lose at tennis. It said if you don't want to lose. The great news about building businesses is you get to define the business, the geography, the unique characteristics, what becomes repeatable. Warren Buffett had a great expression where he said, I didn't get rich investing in all the things I don't understand. He was never a big tech investor. It gets back to that idea of being the hedgehog, of really knowing one thing really well, and you can continue to limit it and limit it and limit it down to something where you are the best in the world at it, or the best of your geography, or the best in the world at the way you define it. And until you have mastered being a monopoly, you have no right going past that. And the side of the road is littered with the carcasses of great technology companies that forgot to scale and market and sell and be commercial. Software is a fashion business. It is all about momentum. It is all about the way you present yourselves. 9 times out of 10, a customer doesn't even know which is better technology in a lot of purchases. It's got to be good, don't get me wrong. It's got to have great reputation. You can't have a crappy product. But at the end of the day, you can have a great product and fail. You can't have a horrible product and succeed, don't get me wrong. But you can have a great product and fail. If you forget to sell and market and scale, and the way we did this, we were probably a 500-person company, and we went to, I believe, 600 trade shows a year at 500 people. We were in front of people. We thought that was a great way of doing it. And I think going down and building a great company is a little bit like a mogul skier. If a skier is up at the top of the mountain and is trying to figure out every mogul they're going to hit on their way down, they're not going to get very far. They do depend on their instincts. Based on the way they come off the first one, they hit the second one. Based on the way they hit the second one, they go to the third one. And again, I'm saying, I'm not against business plans. But don't get too wound up over great or lousy business plans because they're guidelines. And what's more important is what you do in the conference room and with your customers and building your products or building your company day to day. At the end of the day, especially in the entrepreneurial phase, you know, you're driving a speedboat, not a tanker. You don't need 3 miles of visibility, especially when you're entrepreneurial and building to that first 200, 400, or 1,000 employees. There was a great joke that Groucho Marx had. I would never join a country club that would have me as a member. We took this at heart in our recruiting. The minute you start recruiting the wrong people into your business, you failed. And this is why we spend so much time investing in campus recruiting. I actually personally interviewed probably the first 600 or 800 people that joined Manhattan Associates and AirWatch between myself and my partner. And A players recruit A players and B players recruit C players. That is the nature of the world. And the minute you start dropping your standards, or if you don't create that very, very high standard at the very beginning, it is almost impossible to turn that around. It is very easy for a Nordstrom's to become a Walmart. It is very hard for Walmart to become Nordstrom's. That has to be ingrained in the DNA of the company from the very beginning. And in that recruiting, you've got to be knowing what to look for. And we believe there's 3 kinds of people in this world. The ones that, number one, if you tell them to go do something, they can't do it and nobody wants them. There's a second person that if you go tell them to do a job and how to do it, they will go get it done. But there's a third type of person that you point in the right direction and they're going to go figure it out. And I think part of that is innate. I think some of it is taught and some of it is innate. But I think a lot of people that are able to be that third type of person, that are the really important people in companies, a lot of them go to the wrong company and get that driven out of them in their career. I always like the expression that when we're born, we all know how to sing and dance, but it's 20 years of society that grinds those skills out of us. Well, you take somebody who's a real entrepreneurial spirit and can get a lot done and put them in an environment where for 10 or 20 years, they're told what to do and how to do it and punished, if you will, if they go out of the lines. Those are the people that have wasted their skills. And have always needed to have that third type of person because you don't go from 100 to 2,000 employees by telling people what to do. We've got to be matrix organizations where we can pull teams together very quickly. And so, we almost force people into that third type of skill set. And finally, as you're managing people's careers, Jim Collins also had the expression that it's like getting people on a bus. And if you bring a bunch of people on a bus and say, the bus is going to Chicago, and it shows up in Cleveland, you got a lot of really unhappy people on that bus. Setting the right expectations. But if you say, we're going to go get a bus and we don't know where we're going, but we're going to have a great time, you've got a lot of flexibility. But you've got to not only get the right people on the bus with the right expectations, you've got to get them in the right seats. And I've seen so many instances where people take a person who's got a skill set of doing and turn them into a manager, or expect someone who's really only good at managing and push them into a role where they have to really do something. And you've got to be really careful about looking and evaluating people's skill sets. And this may be probably the most important right here. Where Bobby Knight said, every player I ever coached had the will to win, very few had the will to practice to win. I know everybody that raises their hand and says, I want to be an entrepreneur. I don't know as many that I see 9 o'clock on a Saturday night taking out the trash. And I hired one of my biggest eyes wide open mistaken hires. I had a great salesperson at Manhattan Associates when it was a larger company, and he said, Alan, I know I can be a startup guy. I started up my own company 10 years ago. I know I was wildly successful at Manhattan Associates when it was bigger, but I can go back, it's like Rocky going back in the gym. Coach, I want to go and get the crap kicked out of me in the boxing ring again. And I said, look, this is not for everybody. And we brought him in, and it was a dismal failure. And he had this glorified idea of entrepreneurship, but it was about starting with something small, having a lot of equity, and making a lot of money. But when he really got into the crappy hotels and the way we traveled and the office environment and being said no to by a lot of companies that we were marketing to and selling to that weren't ready for our product, he didn't really have what it took to go through that process. And I think so many entrepreneurs have the will to build successful companies. They don't always have the will to do what it takes. And people think the grass is always greener on the other side sometimes. And I'm here to say it's really not. It's greener where you water it. As you think about where you spend your time, what type of people you surround yourself with, what type of organization you associate yourself with, how hard you work in terms of building those skills, if you want to be an entrepreneur, an intrapreneur, or a great employee at a company who moves up very quickly. It's where you make those investments. But finally, what I have found is that people get confused about how does this all get done? And there was a great scene out of City Slickers, and when they asked Curly the meaning of life, and his final answer was, right before he died, he said, "Life is about one thing." And that was the end of his answer. And the irony is that he didn't die and not give the answer. He had just given the answer. What you're going to find is that life is about one thing. It's about whatever you want to make it. And if it's making those sacrifices for those number of years to be successful, if it's how you interact with your family, if it's what kind of lifestyle you want, if it's where you want to live, once you prioritize what's important to you, life is going to make a whole lot more sense and you're going to be a whole lot more successful. Because until you do that, I find that life can be really confusing for a lot of people because they're pulled in so many different directions with 7 number 1 priorities. So with that, I want to thank everybody a whole lot. I think can we do a couple of questions, and then I'm going to stay over at the reception for a little bit in case there's any more. So, yes. We had lots of other things that we had ideas on. And so there was network access control, there was IP address management. The interesting thing was our customers were dragging us into 6 or 7 areas, and it's where we actually had to kind of narrow down. And back to 90% of life is just showing up, but you've got to show up, you've got to listen, you've got to communicate, you've got to talk. I tend to build companies off trade show floors. Because it is amazing when you have 30, 40, 50 people at a trade show who walk by and you get into an interesting conversation. Each conversation is a little bit like one stone of a mosaic. No individual conversation gives you the picture, but you have 20, 30, 40 of those conversations over the course of a day or several trade shows in an area. And it's amazing if you are open to learning from those people, not trying to sell to them, but let them educate you through interesting conversations. Number one, they really want to talk because they have problems that they want to solve. And if they've got problems they want to solve, there's probably a business opportunity there.
The question is about VMware acquiring AirWatch. So probably they might have approached you with an offer last year. So when you have to make a decision like that, so when somebody like VMware acquires AirWatch, it could go both ways. Give you some kind of approach. So how do you decide? Or is it a money? How do you decide?
So, I had done well enough at AirWatch at Manhattan Associates that money was really off the table as an issue for me. It was very important to me that our, at the time, 1,500 employees found a good home and that it was a great long-term home. We did not want AirWatch to acquire us. We did not want to be acquired. We were fortunate after our funding from Insight Ventures, one of the largest fundings ever. We were well known, and we had every major player come to us and have a conversation. And we used it as an opportunity to politely ask them to partner, and tell them why they shouldn't go into this space against us. That we had already kind of won the scale war, that we didn't need to make money for a long time, that we were going to scorch the earth. And in talking to the VMware folks, as we got to know them, kind of a bond was created where we felt that these were really good people, that this was a really good home, that they had technologies that we needed that was going to put an exclamation point behind our success, that it was going to be their scaling that they could give us internationally, that they were already established, that they had such a broad footprint, that it wasn't just VMware. They're owned, for the most part, by EMC, which is a much larger company that also owns RSA and security. They brought so many ingredients to us that we felt were really important. And the last thing that you want, and you see a lot of software companies that do great until they don't, and then they get kind of bought on the downside. We were clearly on the upside and doing fantastic. But we felt that they could really accelerate our growth, accelerate what was really more important to us was that AirWatch become the de facto standard, the de facto name, and that they were really good people in the way they treat their employees, and that they would do the same with ours. And since then, it's really been a fantastic combination.
So a couple times during your presentation, you mentioned it's really important to monopolize a skill set, being really well-focused and expert in your area. What would you say about being well-rounded and having a diversity of interests?
As an individual?
Or on a company level?
I think it's death to a company. I think a company needs to spend a little bit of time looking outside its markets, but I think that losing that laser focus has more downside than upside. Individually, clearly I think there's a lot of value to being well-rounded and well-diversified. I think when you go into a mode of what I'll call building a company, I think you've got to limit that enough so that you become that expert. And when I talk about becoming a hedgehog, it doesn't mean that there's degrees of that. So certainly in school, I was a Bachelor of Arts, not of Science. I was a chemistry major. I came out of other areas. I go back and say there's lots of ways to be successful. But I think if you're really going to make the commitment to start a company, that I think that laser focus and tenacity is one of those contributing factors to success.
When you started your first company, how long would you say that it took to gain the capital, be able to hire employees and pay them, actually get your full business set up? And was it frustrating?
Wasn't frustrating, other than that I did it twice. The second time, it probably took me 30 days. I had saved some money, and that was our capital. We were hiring employees from the first couple of months because we knew what we were doing, but it was a services business. It wasn't a software business. We weren't building a product. And I don't see anything wrong with that. I think the fact that we were able to sell our talents at an hourly rate and bring in income, we learned a lot about that company and what they needed and brought in some skills as a result. So, we don't have the story of I was maxed out on my credit cards and they were foreclosing on my house. And we were a profitable business from day one, and we had an awful lot of demand for what we were doing.
When treading new waters, how do you balance learning versus actually?
Sometimes you put different teams on it, depending on where you are in size and scale. So,
Very small scale. Very beginning. You're researching a new area.
First of all, if you're very small and you've got something and something you're trying to learn, you may be trying to do too much. If it's not, you're trying to learn more about what you already know, then it's not mutually exclusive. But to be doing A well and say, I'm very small, but I'm going to invest in B, I think branching off can have more opportunities for downside than necessarily upside. And now look, these are rules of thumb and always situational. So the fact that we were doing Wi-Fi and we said, crappy business. We're going to keep doing Wi-Fi, but we're going to get into network management for enterprises. Not a great business. We're going to do mobile device management for ruggedized devices. A little bit better business. This opportunity's out here in phones that we've learned a lot about, but we're really hearing in the market that that's the way things are going. Boom, let's get on that. Great business. Let's almost starve off those other businesses. Let's let them continue because they were cash cows. But the the phone management business that it was not profitable, but we were investing heavily in it. But it was truly the laser focus. And I had to take my partner, who still kind of felt committed to that Wi-Fi business, grab him by the ears and say, no, over here. This is where we need to spend our time. So he needed to get pulled out of the legacy business that he still felt part of, because it was a good business. You know, when I say not a great business, it was still growing at 30, 40% year over year and was doing well when it had attention. It just wasn't the business that we really needed to be in. Does that kind of answer your question? One more.
Going into security, especially dealing with governmental and federal agencies, how much overhead do you or does the company have with doing this red tape and related to that is how have, if at all, international
You know, a little bit of red tape. We have to go through things like security guidelines and STIGs, and they test our product, and we work with lots of three-letter agencies. And again, I live in Washington, D.C. So you know, is it a big burden? No, we figure it out, and it's an investment. In terms of the post-Snowden age, for our business, it really hasn't had that big an effect. I mean, we work internationally. We've got 400 people over in Europe. And people are very worried about the security of their phones, but they're probably a little more worried about it as it relates to the hardware and the phones themselves and the networks and the carriers and all the traffic that goes through Google. So for us, it has really not had a significant impact, given where we sit in the security ecosystem. So with that, thank you all very much.